the untold story of how the USA American was born. In the year 1776, on the edge of a storm, a nation was born. A land that would soon change the course of history, where freedom would clash with tyranny and a dream of independence would battle against the might of the world's most powerful empire. But the story of the United States didn't begin with flags waving in the air or heroes galloping triumphantly across fields. It began quietly, like the whisper of a distant thunderstorm, an undercurrent of rebellion that slowly began to rise. The year was 1750, and the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America were thriving in their own way. Farmers tilled the land. Merchants filled bustling marketplaces. The colonies were prosperous, self-sustaining, and growing by the year. But they were also becoming restless, for they were still subjects to the British Crown, a king who lived far across the Atlantic Ocean in a land many colonists had never even seen. By the mid-1700s, the British Empire had decided that the colonies must pay for the costly wars they had fought to protect their borders. The first major blow came in 1765, when the Stamp Act was passed, forcing the colonists to pay taxes on all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. The British Empire had demanded their allegiance, and now it demanded their money. It was a cruel injustice to those who had never been given a voice in the British Parliament. The cry, "No taxation without representation," rang out from the streets of Boston to Charleston. But the British Empire didn't hear. Instead, they passed more laws, imposing even heavier taxes. The Four Townshend Acts in 1767 taxed everyday items: paper, glass, tea. These taxes were not just an inconvenience. They were an outright insult to the colonists' sense of freedom. As the protests grew, so did the sense of oppression. The embers of rebellion smoldered under the surface, unnoticed by the empire that thought itself invincible. Then came the Boston Massacre of 1770, a small, volatile protest turned into violence when British soldiers, under extreme pressure, fired into a crowd of colonists. 5 people died, and their blood stained the cobbled streets of Boston. The image of these fallen martyrs spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, stirring the hearts of the oppressed. The British had fired on the very people they were supposed to protect. The betrayal was complete. In the early 1770s, the British placed yet another heavy hand on the colonies, this time with the Tea Act of 1773. The colonies were to buy tea exclusively from the British East India Company, who had a monopoly on the trade. In protest, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor, an act that would go down in history as the Boston Tea Party. This was not a mere protest. It was a defiance, a warning. The British government retaliated with swift punishment, closing the port of Boston and bringing the full force of the empire to bear on the rebellious city. It was clear now. Things were no longer just tense. They were on the brink of war. The year 1775 arrived, and the powder keg finally exploded. The British marched toward Lexington and Concord, seeking to disarm the colonists. The colonists, however, had other plans. The shot heard round the world was fired in Concord, marking the first battle of the American Revolution. The revolution had begun, not in some grand, heroic way, but with a quiet shot in the darkness. The British were coming to seize weapons, but what they were really about to find was a resistance unlike anything they had ever faced. At first, there were only ragtag militias, farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen, led by a man with little military experience, George Washington. Washington had spent years fighting in the French and Indian War, but leading an army against the might of the British was a challenge of a whole different magnitude. Still, he was the man chosen to lead the Continental Army because he embodied what the revolution was about: determination, hope, and a belief in the impossible. As the war unfolded, Washington's army faced overwhelming odds. The British were the greatest military force the world had ever known, yet the colonies' resolve only grew stronger. The battles were brutal, and the survival of the revolution itself was in constant jeopardy. Bunker Hill, a costly battle for the Americans, showed them something critical. They could stand stand toe-to-toe with the British. Even though they lost the battle, they had gained something even more important: confidence. Yet victory would not come easily. Valley Forge, that brutal winter camp in 1777, would become a symbol of the Revolution's resilience. Washington's men were cold, hungry, and on the brink of collapse. They suffered unimaginable hardships, yet they endured. They trained, they fought, and they began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win this war. As the revolution raged on, the colonies found unexpected allies. The French, longtime enemies of Britain, decided to intervene. In Maka 1778, they sent troops, ships, and much-needed support to the American cause. The tide was turning. What had started as a small, isolated uprising now had the support of one of the world's major powers. And then came Yorktown in 1781, a battle that would decide the fate of the American Revolution. The British, led by General Cornwallis, found themselves surrounded by Washington's army on one side and the French Navy on the other. Trapped and out of options, Cornwallis surrendered, and the war was over. The colonies had won. America was free. But the story of America didn't end with victory. The war may have been won, but the real challenge had only just begun. The new nation had no central government, no laws to unify them, and no clear way forward. How could a nation made up of 13 states, each with its own interests, come together to form a lasting government? In 1787, the framers of the new nation came together in Philadelphia. Men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin put their minds together to craft something the world had never seen before: a Constitution, a document that would give birth to a government that was unlike anything in history, a government where power would rest with the people, where each branch of government would keep the others in check. It was a system built to preserve freedom and prevent tyranny. But it wasn't perfect. Even as the Constitution was signed, there were disagreements. What about slavery? What about the rights of women and Native Americans? These questions would not be solved overnight. The struggle for equality and justice would continue, but the seed had been planted. The United States of America was born. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, became the first president of the United States, leading the nation into its infancy. It was a fragile beginning, but the United States had survived its birth. The question now was whether it could survive the years to come. The United States grew, but it did not grow without conflict. It fought battles, internally and externally, and faced challenges that tested its very core, but it endured. From the Civil War to global conflicts, from World War I to World War II, the United States became a global power, a beacon of freedom and democracy. And even today, the ideals set forth by those brave men in the late 18th century continue to shape the world. But what about today? In the 21st century, the United States stands as one of the most powerful nations in the world. But with power comes immense responsibility. The United States faces challenges both at home and abroad. Deep divides plague the nation's political landscape. Questions about equality and justice persist, and the country wrestles with its place in a rapidly changing world. The story of America is far from over. The history of this great nation is still being written. But one thing is clear: the journey from a handful of colonies to the modern-day United States has been a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. But what about the USA today? What's it like living in the United States in the present day, and how has the nation evolved from its revolutionary beginnings to become the superpower it is today? Join us in our next video, where we explore the present-day USA SWATs, its triumphs, its struggles, and what the future might hold for the land that was once born from rebellion.